What if I told you that a small, helpless puppy could change the life of a hardened cop in an instant? It sounds unbelievable, but this is exactly what happened when one dog refused to let go of a police officer. Why did the puppy keep following him? And why did the officer break down in tears after realizing the truth? Stay with me, because this is a story of loyalty, empathy, and an emotional twist you won't see coming. This isn't just another ordinary story about a stray dog wandering the streets. It's a tale that begins with a small puppy and a police officer who thought he had seen it all. It all started in the middle of a busy city, with the hum of traffic, the blur of people walking past, and the sound of sirens in the distance. The officer, who had spent years on the force, was simply going about his usual routine. He had dealt with everything from petty criminals to high-stakes emergencies. Nothing shocked him anymore. His job had hardened him, built a thick shell around his emotions. But little did he know, this day was going to be different. He wasn't expecting much when he left the precinct. Another shift, another patrol. Just another day in the life of a cop, right? After all, he'd seen it all. The good, the bad, and the downright ugly. His patrols were routine. He'd walk the streets, observe the people, check in with the community, and make sure everything was calm. Nothing ever really stood out. But that day was different. As he walked down the street, checking his surroundings, something caught his attention. A tiny little puppy, probably no more than a few months old, trotted up to him. At first, he didn't think much of it. Stray dogs were a dime a dozen in the city. Some people loved them, others ignored them. They were just part of the background noise. This one, though, seemed different. Most stray dogs avoided people, especially cops. They were used to the hustle and bustle of the city, and they quickly learned to keep their distance from the uniforms that roamed the streets. But not this puppy. It didn't run away. It didn't scurry off like most others. Instead, it followed him. Not from a distance, but right behind him, keeping pace as if it had a specific purpose. The officer paused for a moment and glanced down at the dog, surprised by its boldness. It was small, scruffy, and clearly malnourished. But there was something in its eyes, something that caught his attention. He kept walking, and the puppy kept following. At first, he didn't think much of it. Maybe it was hungry. Maybe it just wanted some attention. He wasn't one to get caught up in emotions, so he kept moving forward, hoping the dog would lose interest. But it didn't. It followed him for hours. No matter where he went, the puppy was there, trotting behind him with its little paws tapping on the pavement. The officer, ever the skeptic, told himself it was just a coincidence. But after a few hours, he couldn't ignore it any longer. Something about the puppy's persistence made him pause and wonder, why is it following me? He tried to shake it off. After all, it was just a dog. There were plenty of strays in the city, and they all had their reasons for hanging around people. But as the day turned into night, the puppy didn't leave his side. It was as though the little animal had made a decision. It wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't sure if he should be concerned or amused. But one thing was clear. The puppy wasn't going to stop. He started to wonder if something deeper was at play. Could this be a random act of affection, or was there something more to this behavior? The officer thought back to his own experiences with animals. He had always been a tough guy. He didn't have time for sentimentality, and the idea that an animal could make him feel anything other than annoyance seemed far-fetched. But as he glanced down at the puppy's eyes, he saw something different. It wasn't the typical vacant stare of a stray dog. This puppy's gaze was filled with something much more intense, something that seemed like an appeal. It wasn't just following him for food or attention. It seemed like it was looking for something more. So, why was it so urgent? What was it about this officer that made the puppy feel compelled to follow him, of all people? As the days passed, the officer's curiosity began to grow. He noticed that the puppy wasn't just following him for food. In fact, it hardly seemed interested in eating at all. And it didn't just follow him on his patrols. It followed him to the precinct, sat patiently outside while he worked, and waited by his car when his shift ended. There was no escaping it. The puppy's persistence was uncanny. But the officer, still unsure of what to make of the situation, started to feel a growing unease. Why couldn't this dog let go? Could it be that this puppy had something to tell him? Something that could change his life? It wasn't until a few days later that the officer's tough exterior began to crack. The realization didn't come all at once. It crept up on him slowly, as if life itself was carefully unwrapping a bitter truth. As the officer walked the same street he'd walked every day, something strange happened. The puppy, now more than just a curious animal, stopped in front of a particular house. The officer didn't think much of it at first, but then he saw it. A woman standing in the doorway of the house. The puppy's tail started wagging furiously. It barked, and then something strange happened. The officer watched, stunned, as the woman reached down, and the puppy ran straight into her arms. And that's when it hit him. The woman wasn't just a random passerby. She was someone he knew. The officer recognized her instantly. She was a former colleague, someone he had trusted, someone who had gone off the radar months ago after a series of troubling events. The puppy wasn't just following him randomly, it was leading him straight to the person who had abandoned it. The shock was enough to take the breath out of him. The officer had never expected to find something so personal hidden behind a simple puppy's actions. In that moment, he understood the reason why the puppy had been following him all along. It wasn't just for help. It was because this puppy, abandoned and lost, had known exactly who to turn to for help. And for some inexplicable reason, it had chosen him. But the truth didn't stop there. The officer wasn't just a bystander in this story. He was part of a bigger, more painful narrative, one that would force him to confront emotions he had buried for years. This wasn't just about a puppy finding its way home. It was about a man confronting his own past and the impact his own actions had on the lives of others. And that, as the officer would soon discover, was the most heart-wrenching twist of all. The officer had seen his fair share of stray animals. Dogs, cats, birds, you name it. It was part of the job. And like most cops, he had developed a sort of detached tolerance for the homeless animals he encountered. Most dogs followed officers around for food or attention, nothing out of the ordinary. But this puppy was different. From the very beginning, there was something about its presence that felt urgent. Days passed, and the puppy remained close, too close. It didn't leave him for a moment, not even when he went inside stores, not when he took a short break, and not even when he stopped to speak with fellow officers. It seemed to appear from nowhere, always with a determined look in its eyes, silently following him through the city streets, watching him with an intensity that felt almost purposeful. At first, the officer tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was just lonely. Maybe it had no home and was looking for some kindness. But the more time he spent with it, the more the situation felt like something deeper. There was a gnawing feeling in the officer's gut, a strange, unsettling sensation that told him the puppy wasn't following him by chance. No, this puppy had a reason. It wasn't about food. It wasn't about companionship. There was something bigger at play. What was it? Why would this puppy latch onto him so tenaciously? Why wouldn't it just wander off, like the countless other strays in the city? And then, one afternoon, the officer had had enough. His curiosity finally got the best of him. He needed answers. He had just finished up his shift and was heading home, exhausted, when the puppy once again appeared by his side. But this time, it didn't just follow him. This time, it led him. For the first time, the officer noticed the puppy's actions weren't random. It turned down streets he didn't usually walk, stopping at the very edge of familiar territory. He hesitated for a moment, questioning whether to continue. But the puppy was persistent, and the officer, now more intrigued than ever, couldn't shake the feeling that this was no accident. As he followed the puppy down a quieter, less crowded street, he began to sense that something was amiss. His instincts kicked in. The officer's gut told him this was no simple case of a stray dog seeking attention. This was something far more profound. The puppy stopped abruptly in front of a small, run-down house. The officer slowed his pace, feeling a cold rush of realization wash over him. He didn't know why, but the place felt strangely familiar. He had seen it before. The dog, its tail wagging furiously, stared intently at the door, its eyes full of hope and anticipation. It was clear now. This wasn't just about finding food or shelter. The puppy was waiting for someone. Someone in that house. The officer stood frozen, watching as the puppy continued to bark, its little paws tapping the ground in nervous excitement. Then the door creaked open. The officer's heart skipped a beat as a familiar face appeared in the doorway. It was someone he knew, someone he hadn't seen in months, someone he had trusted. His breath caught in his throat. The woman at the door was not a stranger. She was a former colleague, someone who had been a close ally during his earlier years on the force. He had worked alongside her for years, and at one point had considered her a friend. But there had been no contact since she disappeared. And now, here she was, standing before him, her eyes wide with shock. But it wasn't just the officer who was surprised. The puppy, who had been following him so doggedly for days, was now pulling at her legs, seeking comfort and affection, as if it had finally found the one it had been looking for. For a moment, the officer stood still, unable to comprehend the scene unfolding before him. It took him a few seconds to process it fully. The puppy hadn't been following him for any of the typical reasons he had imagined. It wasn't just looking for food. It wasn't just a random stray in search of a friendly face. This puppy had been abandoned, but not by a random passerby. No, this puppy had been left behind by someone the officer knew personally. Someone he had trusted. Someone who had disappeared from his life without a trace. And suddenly, the officer felt the weight of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. The puppy's loyalty wasn't about him. It wasn't even about finding food or safety. The puppy had been sent to find the woman, its owner. It had been abandoned, and now it was desperately searching for the only person it had ever known. The officer had simply been the one to guide it. The truth was heartbreaking. The puppy had become a symbol of something deeper, something more profound than he could have ever anticipated. It wasn't just a cry for help. It was a desperate attempt to find love and safety again, to find the person who had once cared for it. But that person wasn't just any person. It was someone who had left, who had walked away from everything. And now, the puppy was left to face the aftermath. The officer's mind reeled as the realization set in. The trust and loyalty the puppy had shown him were powerful, but they weren't meant for him. They were meant for the woman who had abandoned it. And in that moment, the officer realized just how deep the emotional bond between them had been. It was a bond that could never truly be broken, no matter the circumstances. The puppy's cry for help was a revelation for the officer. It wasn't just about the dog. It was about the painful truth of abandonment, about people who leave their loved ones behind, and about how loyalty can survive even in the most tragic of circumstances. This wasn't just a life-changing moment for the officer. What started as an unexpected encounter with a stray puppy had turned into a powerful catalyst, igniting a series of events that would change not just the officer's life, but the lives of many others. As soon as the officer realized the puppy's connection to the woman and the heartbreaking truth about its abandonment, something inside him snapped. The realization was profound, not just for the puppy, but for himself. The loyalty and desperation the dog had displayed, the unwavering commitment it showed in following him, had made the officer confront something he had long buried deep inside him. It wasn't just about the dog's needs. It was about something far bigger, something that had been quietly eating away at him for years. The officer had been hardened by the job. Years of dealing with crime, violence, and the darker sides of human nature had made him see the world through a filter of suspicion and mistrust. Emotions, vulnerability, these were things he had left behind, buried under layers of duty and tough decisions. His job had taught him to be strong, to never let his guard down, to never feel too much. In his mind, the world was a place where survival depended on the ability to distance oneself from personal attachment. But all of that began to unravel the moment he realized why the puppy had followed him. It wasn't just a stray seeking help. It wasn't just a dog looking for food or comfort. The puppy had been searching for something deeper, a symbol of loyalty that, even in the face of abandonment, would never let go. It had attached itself to the officer, not out of necessity, but out of sheer, unrelenting trust. The puppy had trusted him to protect it, to keep it safe, and in turn, it had forced the officer to confront his own feelings of abandonment, isolation, and emotional distance. And that's when the officer started to notice the cracks. At first, it was small, just a passing thought here and there, but it quickly grew into something bigger. He started asking himself, had he been neglecting his own emotional health all these years? Had his job and his hardened persona caused him to shut out feelings that he was desperately in need of? Could something as simple as a puppy's loyalty be the thing that made him realize just how much he had been suppressing? Could this little animal, so pure and innocent, spark a deeper transformation in him? The answer was yes, and it was terrifying. The officer, who had once believed he could control everything, began to feel the weight of his own humanity pressing down on him. He wasn't just a cop anymore. He was a person with emotions, fears, and desires. And the puppy had reminded him of something essential, the need for connection. But the transformation didn't stop there. The officer's emotional awakening pushed him to take action in ways he had never anticipated. When he learned about the puppy's abandonment, he couldn't ignore the larger issue. This wasn't an isolated case. He soon realized that the puppy's story was just one of many. The more he dug, the more he uncovered. The abandoned dog was just the tip of the iceberg. There were more cases of neglect, more stories of animals being left to fend for themselves. He began to notice a disturbing pattern. Stray animals were more than just a result of poverty or neglect. They were a symptom of something much darker. The officer's shock and disbelief deepened as he investigated. He started seeing how widespread the problem was. Animals were being abandoned by the very people who were supposed to care for them, the same people who had once promised to protect them. He discovered cases of cruelty. Dogs left tied up in alleys, starved for days, abandoned on the streets like they were disposable objects. Some were found in deplorable conditions, emaciated and sick, barely clinging to life. Others had been dumped, left to roam aimlessly, just like the puppy that had followed him. The officer took these findings back to his department, and soon a full investigation was underway. What had begun as a personal moment of awakening now turned into a larger mission. The officer became deeply involved in uncovering and addressing these cases of neglect. He worked tirelessly with animal rescue organizations, helping to expose abusive situations and bringing justice to animals that had been forgotten. But the real change came in the form of the impact on his approach to his job. His mindset began to shift. No longer could he simply go through the motions, do his job, and move on. His hardened exterior had been shattered by the puppy's loyalty, and in its place was a deep, emotional responsibility. He was no longer just a cop patrolling the streets. He was someone who understood the weight of his actions, the ripple effect they had on those around him, whether human or animal. But the puppy's influence didn't stop at just changing his approach to his job. It also impacted his relationships with the people around him. The officer, who had always kept his distance from others, began opening up to his colleagues, to his friends, and even to family members he had long neglected. It wasn't easy. He had built a wall around himself for so long that it felt foreign to engage on a personal level. But the puppy had forced him to recognize that isolation was not the answer, that it was okay to ask for help. It was okay to feel vulnerable. And as the officer opened up, he began to see the profound impact it had on those around him. His colleagues noticed the change. They saw a man who had once been an impenetrable fortress slowly learning to trust again. They saw a man who could still do his job with professionalism and authority, but who was also capable of empathy and compassion. The officer, who had once been so guarded, now understood the value of connection, of caring for those in need, and of offering help when it was most needed. Could this simple, heartfelt act change the course of a person's life? The answer was unequivocally yes. The puppy's following wasn't just a plea for help. It was a wake-up call, a sudden jolt that forced the officer to confront his own demons. The puppy, with its boundless loyalty and love, had cracked open the officer's emotional armor. And in doing so, it sparked a transformation that would shape the rest of his life. In the end, the officer learned a powerful lesson, that sometimes the greatest acts of bravery come not from the hardened hearts of soldiers or cops, but from the simplest of creatures, from a puppy who, in its pure, unshakable loyalty, had the power to tear down walls and rebuild a man from the inside out. It was a transformation that wasn't just personal, it had far-reaching consequences. The officer had now dedicated himself to a new cause, a new mission, to ensure that the puppies and all animals were no longer left to face the world alone. His fight wasn't just for justice in the streets, it was for a better, more compassionate world for everyone, including the ones who could never speak for themselves. The puppy had saved him, and now the officer was determined to save others. So, what made this moment so powerful? The answer lies in understanding the very essence of what happened between the officer and the puppy. It wasn't just a simple act of a puppy following a person. It was a moment of deep, instinctual communication that transcended the need for words. What makes this interaction so remarkable is that it speaks to something universally human, the raw, emotional connection that can exist between two beings, regardless of species. The puppy didn't need to speak. It didn't need to bark or wag its tail to get the officer's attention. It simply followed him, step by step, as if it knew that this person could help. The puppy's actions were a form of non-verbal communication, a signal that spoke directly to the officer's heart, bypassing all the usual emotional barriers that he had built over the years as a hardened police officer. To understand why this moment was so powerful, we need to break down the psychology and the science behind the puppy's behavior, as well as the deeper emotional bond that formed in that fleeting moment. Nonverbal communication is a powerful form of interaction that often goes unnoticed in our daily lives. It's easy to assume that communication is always verbal, something that requires words to convey meaning. But in reality, much of human interaction is driven by nonverbal cues. Body language, facial expressions, and the tone of voice all contribute to how we connect with others. And it's not just humans who use these forms of communication. Animals, especially dogs, have a remarkable ability to understand and respond to nonverbal signals. In fact, dogs are some of the best nonverbal communicators in the animal kingdom. Their acute senses of sight, smell, and hearing allow them to detect the subtlest changes in human behavior. A dog can sense when a person is anxious, sad, or happy, simply by observing their body language and reading their facial expressions. In the case of this puppy, its decision to follow the officer wasn't just a random act. It was a response to something deeply rooted in its instincts. This puppy wasn't just looking for food or attention. It was responding to the officer's emotional state and his overall energy. Animals have a unique ability to detect changes in the environment and in the people around them. While humans rely heavily on verbal communication to convey their thoughts and feelings, animals like dogs communicate through actions and behavior. The puppy's actions, following the officer, were a clear indication of its recognition of the officer's potential to offer help and support. But what made this bond even more fascinating was the way in which the puppy was able to communicate its need for help without using any words at all. Instead of barking or whining, it simply followed the officer, a quiet but powerful form of communication that spoke volumes. At the core of this behavior is the puppy's emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence refers to the ability to recognize, understand, and manage one's own emotions, as well as the ability to recognize and respond to the emotions of others. While we typically associate emotional intelligence with humans, animals, particularly dogs, possess a remarkable ability to sense and respond to the emotional states of those around them. Dogs have been living alongside humans for thousands of years, and over that time, they have developed an incredible sensitivity to human emotions. Their heightened senses allow them to detect even the smallest changes in our mood, energy, and emotional state. The puppy's behavior toward the officer was an expression of this emotional intelligence. The puppy didn't just follow the officer because it was hungry or lonely. It followed because it sensed something deeper, a need for help. This is where emotional intelligence plays a key role. The puppy recognized that the officer, in his role as a protector and guardian, had the ability to provide the safety and comfort that the puppy needed. It wasn't just instinct, it was a deeply intuitive understanding that led the puppy to choose the officer as its source of support. In that moment, the puppy wasn't just seeking physical sustenance, it was seeking emotional and psychological safety, and it had the emotional intelligence to know exactly who to turn to. To understand this better, let's think about how humans respond to certain situations. When a person is feeling distressed or vulnerable, they often seek comfort from those they trust. Family members, friends, or even strangers who exude a sense of kindness and empathy. Similarly, animals like dogs have an innate ability to seek out individuals who they perceive as trustworthy and capable of offering help. The puppy, in this case, instinctively knew that the officer was the one who could provide that safety. It recognized the officer's calm demeanor, his reassuring energy, and perhaps even the subtle cues from his body language that signaled he was someone who could be trusted. What's even more remarkable is the level of trust that the puppy placed in the officer. Trust is a fundamental aspect of any meaningful relationship, human or animal. It's the foundation upon which bonds are built. In this situation, the puppy's trust in the officer was absolute. It didn't know him personally, nor could it understand the details of his life. But it understood on a primal level that this officer was the one who could offer protection, security, and the promise of care. This level of trust is something we see in many animals, particularly dogs. Their loyalty and faith in their human companions are often unwavering, and this bond is what makes the relationship between humans and dogs so special. But the puppy's trust wasn't just a passive feeling, it was an active decision. In following the officer, the puppy was essentially putting its fate in the hands of this person. It wasn't a decision made out of desperation alone. It was a choice made from instinct, from an understanding that the officer was someone who could offer something meaningful and life-changing. The puppy's actions were a form of non-verbal communication that conveyed its need for help and its trust in the officer's ability to provide that help. And in doing so, it created an emotional moment that would forever change the officer's perspective. At its core, the puppy's behavior was driven by instinct. Instinct is a powerful force in the animal kingdom. It's the innate drive that animals have to survive, to seek food, shelter, and safety. Instinct is what drives the puppy to seek out help when it's in danger, or when it feels vulnerable. But while instinct is often associated with survival, it's also closely tied to emotional responses. The puppy's instinct wasn't just about finding food. It was about finding safety, comfort, and connection. And in following the officer, the puppy was reaching out in the only way it knew how. Through its actions, through its silent communication that spoke louder than words ever could. In a world that often values logic and reason over emotion and connection, the puppy's behavior serves as a reminder of the power of instinct and emotional intelligence. Sometimes, the most important messages are the ones that are communicated without words. The officer's response to the puppy's silent plea for help was a profound moment of realization, one that forced him to confront his own emotional barriers and question the way he viewed the world. What makes this story so moving is not just the puppy's ability to communicate its needs. It's the way in which the officer responded. The officer, a person accustomed to maintaining control and emotional distance, was forced to let down his guard. The puppy's silent communication broke through his emotional armor and reminded him of the vulnerability and connection that exist in the world. It was a wake-up call, one that made him see the world in a different light. The puppy's actions, though simple, carried a profound message about the power of nonverbal communication, emotional intelligence, and the importance of trust. The puppy didn't need to say a word to convey its message. It simply followed, a quiet but powerful form of communication that touched the officer's heart and changed his life forever. In the end, the puppy's loyalty wasn't just about survival, it was about connection, trust, and the deep emotional intelligence that allowed it to seek out someone who could provide the safety and comfort it needed. And in doing so, it helped the officer realize the importance of vulnerability, empathy, and the unspoken bonds that tie us all together. This is the beauty of nonverbal communication. It can change lives, bridge gaps, and create connections that words can never fully explain. This heartwarming story of the puppy's loyalty and the officer's emotional awakening also raises a number of difficult questions. While it's easy to admire the officer's eventual change of heart, we can't ignore some of the challenges and contradictions that the story presents. Was the officer too caught up in his own world, focused on the day-to-day grind of his job, to notice the puppy's distress earlier? As a police officer, he was undoubtedly accustomed to dealing with emergencies, conflicts, and violence. In a world that often prioritizes tasks over emotions, could it be that the officer simply hadn't made space to recognize the silent cries of help from those who couldn't communicate in the same way humans do? The puppy didn't just appear out of nowhere. It had been following him for days, silently asking for help. Shouldn't the officer have picked up on the signs sooner? It's easy for us, the viewers, to sit back and analyze the situation with the clarity that hindsight provides. We can easily say that the officer should have recognized the puppy's distress immediately, or that he should have been more proactive in looking out for animals in need of help. After all, as a police officer, his job is to protect and serve. Doesn't that include protecting animals too? However, the reality is much more complex. The officer's life, just like anyone else's, is full of distractions, stresses, and emotional baggage. He's human after all, and sometimes it takes a significant event to wake someone up to the needs of others, whether human or animal. This event didn't just change the officer's understanding of the world, it profoundly shifted his priorities. His previous lack of attention to the puppy's suffering may not have been a conscious choice. It may have simply been the result of being overwhelmed by the demands of his job and the emotional walls he had built over the years. He didn't know what the puppy was going through until that moment when it followed him so persistently that he couldn't ignore it any longer. But once he became aware of the puppy's pain, it was as if a veil had been lifted, and his eyes were opened to the larger issue of animal cruelty and neglect. Some might argue that the officer should have done more for animals before this pivotal moment, especially since he was part of a system that could have taken action. Police officers, especially those in urban areas, often encounter situations of animal distress, from strays to injured pets, and are sometimes in a position to help. Shouldn't he have been more attuned to the plight of vulnerable animals in his community? It's easy to see how the officer could be criticized for not having taken action sooner. But this criticism fails to acknowledge the emotional transformation that he underwent as a result of the puppy's unwavering loyalty. The story isn't just about the officer's failure to act, it's about how a single event changed him for the better. While the officer's oversight of animal suffering before this event could be criticized, it's equally important to understand the broader societal issues that contribute to the neglect of animals. Animal cruelty and neglect are widespread issues that affect communities all over the world. Many animals, especially strays, live in harsh conditions, often unnoticed and unprotected. The responsibility of caring for animals should not fall solely on the shoulders of one individual, even one as well-meaning as the officer. Society as a whole needs to be more proactive in protecting animals and ensuring their well-being. The officer's change of heart is important, but it also highlights the larger systemic problem of animal neglect and the need for more comprehensive solutions, including better animal welfare laws, more community involvement, and greater public awareness. It's also important to recognize that the officer's emotional transformation was not immediate or without its struggles. After all, the officer had been hardened by years of policing, a profession that often requires individuals to suppress their emotions to maintain composure in the face of trauma and danger. The officer's initial reaction to the puppy's distress was shaped by this emotional armor, a defense mechanism built over time to cope with the harsh realities of law enforcement. It wasn't easy for him to acknowledge the vulnerability of the puppy, nor was it easy for him to confront his own vulnerabilities as a result. In some ways, the officer's delayed recognition of the puppy's pain may have been a reflection of his emotional exhaustion and the psychological toll that his job had taken on him. However, once he realized what the puppy had been trying to communicate, the officer's perspective shifted dramatically. He began speaking out about the importance of paying attention to the world around us, especially when it comes to those who can't speak for themselves. In interviews and public statements, the officer began advocating for better treatment of animals, encouraging others to be more mindful of the creatures around them, and promoting the idea that small acts of compassion can make a world of difference. His message was clear. We all need to be more aware of the suffering that exists just beneath the surface, and we all have a responsibility to help those who are unable to advocate for themselves. In this sense, the officer's transformation is not just a personal one, it's a call to action for all of us. We can't afford to ignore the quiet cries for help that often go unnoticed. The story of the puppy and the officer is a poignant reminder that sometimes it takes a single moment of clarity to make us realize the impact we can have on the lives of others, whether human or animal. It's a story that forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that we don't always do enough for those in need. But it also offers a glimmer of hope. Change is possible, and it often starts with one person who is willing to listen, to care, and to act. In the end, while the officer's delayed realization may be a source of criticism, it's equally a powerful testament to the capacity for growth and change that exists within all of us. It shows that even the most hardened individuals can be moved by compassion and can learn to recognize the suffering that surrounds them. This is a story not just about one officer and one puppy. It's about how a single act of loyalty can ripple outward and inspire change on a larger scale. And that, in itself, is something worth celebrating. So, what's the takeaway from this story? It's simple. Life has a way of showing us the most profound lessons in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes we need to slow down, take a breath, and open ourselves up to the world around us, because those moments that can change us forever are often hidden in plain sight. This story is a powerful reminder that compassion and awareness can come from the most unlikely places. A puppy, in its purest form of loyalty, made an officer see the world differently. If a small act of compassion can transform a hardened individual, imagine what it could do for all of us if we choose to be more aware and intentional in our daily lives. Whether it's a stray animal on the street or a person silently struggling, you have the power to make a difference. Now, let me ask you this. What if you were the one who could change someone's life with a single moment of kindness? If you felt inspired by this story, just imagine the impact you could have by simply taking the time to notice the needs of those around you, human or animal. Compassion doesn't have to be a grand gesture. It's the small, everyday actions that accumulate to create real change. So if you want more heartwarming and life-changing stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel. I'll be sharing more content that will inspire, challenge, and encourage you to be the change you want to see in the world. And if you've ever had a life-changing moment that came out of nowhere, something that made you stop, reflect, and shift your perspective, drop it in the comments below. I'd love to hear your story and how it transformed you. Together, we can all make a difference. One story, one action at a time.